Either in all the circumstances I behaved reasonably and legally.
As far as I can see, he stuck to the rules and he acted legally.
Durham Police aren't quite so sure. Although they say driving to Durham during lockdown was within the regulations, they think the hour-round trip to Barnard Castle might have been a minor breach of the regulations that would have warranted police intervention. The statement goes on, had a Durham Constabulary police officer stopped Mr Cummings driving to or from Barnard Castle, the officer would have spoken to him and, having established the facts, likely advised Mr Cummings to return to the address in Durham.
I also noticed that the Durham Police said was that they were going to take no action and that the matter was closed, and I intend to draw a line under the matter as I...
Journalists longing to ask the science advisors at his side what they made of Dominic Cummings' behaviour were warded off.
I'm going to interpose myself, if I may, and protect them from what I think would be an unfair and unnecessary attempt to ask a political question. Is very, very...
The Prime Minister wanted attention on what he knows will be a longed-for relaxation of lockdown in England. It starts from Monday.
We will allow up to 6 people to meet outside, provided those from different households continue strictly to observe social distancing rules. So, we will now allow people to meet in gardens and other private outdoor spaces. These changes mean that friends and family can start to meet their loved ones, perhaps seeing both parents at once or both grandparents at once. And I know that for many people this will be a long-awaited and joyful moment. And it remains the case that people should not be inside the homes of their friends and families, not inside the homes of your friends and families, unless it is to access the garden, to get to the garden.
Test and trace works because it allows localised patterns of infection to be detected and contained.
The government also formally kicked off its Test and Trace programme, which targets lockdown on individuals who are at risk of having COVID-19 and who'll be told they must stay home.
Yes, you must self-isolate, and I know that is going to be hard and it is going to be difficult for people, but do not forget that this is the way to beat it.
If you test positive for COVID-19 now, you should get a call, a text or an email alert within 24 hours, which will tell you to go online and share names and contact details of people you've been close to in the last 48 hours. That means people you were 2 metres away from for 15 minutes or more, or people you were closer to for an even briefer period of time. Those people will then get an alert telling them to self-isolate at home for 14 days from the moment of contact with the COVID sufferer. Even if you test negative, you must still stay locked in.
Well, as long as my wages were paid, then I guess I stay at home.
I think personally I would, just completely obey it, really. I mean, we're in such a terrible situation that I can't see that there's any other way around it.
I think now there's more and more people who, because of Dominic Cummings, now he's just saying, well, there's a rule for me and there's a rule for everybody else. I can do what I want. But you see now people, and I talk to people now around here, and they're saying, well, if Dominic Cummings can do it, so can I.
From Friday, Scotland will follow many of the loosenings of restrictions which came into effect in England 2 weeks ago. There too, people will be allowed to go to meet other households in a garden with a cap of 8 in the group.
We are not putting a legal limit on how far you can travel to meet another household, but please use your good judgment. If the distance is so far that you would have to use someone else's bathroom, then perhaps you shouldn't be doing it.
An NHS England Test and Trace call centre starting its work today. With no phone app working alongside it and some tracers complaining of technical glitches, it's running to keep up with an easing of the shutdown that edges forward again on Monday.
Gary Gibbon, well, we asked the government for an interview and we also invited more than 50 Conservative MPs individually, but no one was available. Earlier, I spoke to Professor of Global Public Health at Edinburgh, Devi Sridhar, and I began by asking whether the Prime Minister's 5 tests for starting to lift lockdown are being met.
Well, no, I think actually these are all subject to interpretation. So one of the areas that is a bit concerning today from the new ONS survey results is that there's close to 1,000 new infections still occurring, and this has been during lockdown. So to have a testing and tracing system and hoping this could take over at this level infection, it's going to be a big ask right now.
So would you say that this judgment that the 5 tests are being met is a scientific judgment or a political judgment?
I think right now it's a political judgment. I think also, for example, the test around, is there adequate testing, is there adequate PPE? These are, I guess, subject to interpretation. Ideally, if we look like a country like Germany, they're testing teachers, they're testing students. We clearly don't have capacity in the UK for that level yet. Do we have enough capacity to test second-order contacts? That means when someone is, told they're exposed, it's not clear we'll be able to test them either.
Now, the other really interesting and puzzling information that came out today from the ONS was that their survey suggests that over 2/3 of people who've had the virus were asymptomatic. Does this mean that a lot more of us have had the virus than we currently think?
Well, I guess there's 2 ways to read it. So the first thing is probably these people are pre-symptomatic. That means that they're not yet having symptoms. They have the virus, but they will be in the next 4 to 5 days. The second point on, does it say that actually the iceberg is larger? Well, we also found out in the ONS survey today that actually the iceberg is not that much larger. There were hopes that 20 to 30% of the population could have been exposed. And actually, it's not. The numbers that came back look to be between 6 and 7%, which is in line with what you've seen with France, with Sweden, with parts of the US that have tested, which means a very small percentage of the country have actually been exposed to this virus so far. And it means the outbreak still has a long way to go if it's not contained quickly.
Now, at the daily press conference today, Boris Johnson did something quite astonishing in that he stopped the chief scientist and the medical advisor from answering questions from the press on what they thought of Dominic Cummings' behaviour and whether it set a good example to the public, saying it was a political question. Is this a political question, or is it more than that?
I don't see this as a political question. It's a question around trying to get the trust of the public to comply with pretty drastic measures for the next few weeks, few months, until we have a better solution. And so it seems like the actions of the government are undermining itself. They're trying right now to carry a government and carry a public, but actually let's think, what are the principles of good governance? The principles of good governance are fairness, transparency, honesty, solidarity. And right now, I think the government is struggling.
Devi Sridhar, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And it's worth adding that Downing Street is now clarifying their version of what happened, which is that the Prime Minister's advisors, the Chief Scientific Officer and the Chief Medical Officer, were free to answer those questions about Dominic Cummings when they were asked about it by journalists later.
So now, how is the news that there is to be no further action against Mr. Cummings going down in Barnard Castle, the town he said he drove to merely to test his eyesight? Our correspondent, Kieran Jenkins, is right there now. Kieran.
Well, John, Barnard Castle may prove to be a difficult place for Dominic Cummings. The police found no breaches on 2 of the allegations against him, but they found that Mr. Cummings might have breached the regulations by driving to this area. Now, people have been out in Barnard Castle today enjoying themselves. It's been glorious weather. But on April the 12th, when Dominic Cummings took a trip this way, the guidance was rather different. And in early April, Boris Johnson himself urged people to stay home, even if there was fine weather. But Mr. Cummings said he drove his family near here because he'd been ill and he was worried about his eyesight before driving back to London. So what have people and the police here made of those claims? The police have finally spoken when Dominic Cummings dashed out of London to the family estate in Durham, a 260-mile journey to be near childcare with his child and wife, who he thought might have COVID. No offence committed, say Durham Police. There were allegations Mr. Cummings denied that he was seen breaching lockdown in Huffle Woods near Durham on April 19th. Insufficient evidence, say Durham Police. And then there was Mr. Cummings' trip to Barnard Castle, April 12th. By his own admission, he took his family on a 60-mile drive to see if he could safely drive.
My wife was very worried, particularly given my eyesight had seemed to have been affected by the disease. She did not want to risk a nearly 300-mile drive with our child, given how ill I had been.
On Sunday, Boris Johnson was asked about parallels with Scotland's chief medical officer, who resigned after visiting her second home.
Unlike the lady you mentioned, Mr. Cummings actually went into lockdown because he had symptoms, went into self-isolation for 14 days or more.
But after isolating, Dominic Cummings did venture out. Durham Police say it might have been a minor breach of the regulations that would have warranted police intervention. Minor because there was no apparent breach of social distancing. Durham constabularies say that had the police stopped Mr. Cummings on his drive to Barnard Castle, they would likely have advised him to return to the address in Durham, and they'd have reminded him of the dangers of travelling during this pandemic. And that raises some questions for those who've defended Mr. Cummings. If there were no issue whatsoever, then why would the police have likely advised him to turn back? So are they moving on here as the Prime Minister hopes? In this shop, yes, reluctantly. It should be
fined.
Fined?
Yeah.
But that's not going to happen.
No.
So what should we do now?
Move on.
You think?
Yeah.
Elaine and her husband, on Stuart's first day out in 12 weeks, are not. You feel they should draw a line under it?
No.
Nope.
No. I think he needs to be dealt with to set an example. So we've all stuck to the rules to try and keep numbers down, etc., etc., and he's just flouting it in front of us, making a mockery of what we're doing.
And it's unresolved for museum worker Katie. What should happen now?
Well, I think he should have probably resigned, but I don't think that's going to happen.
In the end, it was the sighting of Mr. Cummings here that means this row may stick around, despite the police finding no breach in the other alleged infractions. Dominic Cummings said he behaved legally, but when he set off for Barnard Castle, there was no turning back. And had he been stopped by the police, they would likely have told him to do just that.
Well, joining me now from North London is the Shadow Attorney General, Lord Faulkner. Boris Johnson's position remains that Dominic Cummings' behaviour was lawful. What can you draw from what Durham Police have said about whether the behaviour was lawful or not?
Well, I mean, it looks, on the basis of what the Durham Police have said, that Dominic Cummings has got away with it. I think he unquestionably broke the law. I have not met anybody, lawyer or non-lawyer, who doesn't think he broke the law. The only group of people who think that he didn't was the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Foreign Secretary, the Minister from the Cabinet Office, and the Attorney General. And they all used their position to try to say he hadn't broken the law, and probably because of that, he has got away with it. And it is rather shocking.
I mean, you could say it's fine for a Cabinet Minister to express an opinion about the law. Is there any difference in the Attorney General expressing an opinion about the law?
It's not fine for a Cabinet Minister, let alone the Prime Minister, to express an opinion about whether somebody's broken the criminal law while it's been considered by the authorities. But it's, as you say, it is certainly not okay for the Attorney General, who is responsible for the enforcement of the criminal law, to express a view about whether somebody is guilty or innocent. And the current Attorney General, in effect, on a social media platform, expressed support for Dominic Cummings when there was a question mark over whether he committed a criminal offence. And that is breaking with the most basic principles of constitutional propriety as far as the Attorney General is concerned.
All the opinion polling and, you know, people being stopped in the street by journalists on every TV channel shows that the British public know perfectly well what the law is and what you should and shouldn't do. So ultimately, is there any damage to public health? Should you just move on?
I think huge damage has been done to the sense that the law will be enforced. The purpose of this law was to protect public health. When it suited the executive to push it to one side for one of their own, they used all the firepower they could get, including the Attorney General, to avoid the prosecution of Dominic Cummings. What does that say about their respect for the law? More significantly, maybe in the immediate horizon, is what does it say about people's willingness to comply with the public health messages and the public health law which they've introduced? I think it is rather terrible.
What was your view of the Prime Minister's approach to Laura Kuenssberg's question to the chief scientific advisor and the chief medical officer about Dominic Cummings? Was he right to say that's a political question, it's not for public servants like them?
No, I think his approach was completely wrong. If he's willing to express detailed opinions on the law, why shouldn't the scientists express whether they think the issue about how Dominic Cummings has been treated will affect public health? It smacked of somebody with something to hide because he knew what the scientists would say.
Lord Faulkner, thank you very much.
Now, as it emerges that the United Kingdom has one of the highest death rates in the world, I've been speaking to Professor Peter Piot, the director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. His career has been devoted to understanding and combating viruses, including Ebola and AIDS. He contracted COVID-19 in March and was hospitalised and is now recovering at home. I began by asking him why it is that the death rates here in Britain are quite so bad.
The main reason is that we started quite late with all kinds of measures, later than many countries. If you compare, for example, to Germany, we're talking now about quarantine, for example, on travels returning, which doesn't make sense whatsoever. This is something you do when there are no cases or very few. When you deal with epidemic, there's no time to lose. It's really acting early that makes the biggest impact.
Test, track, and trace, I mean, will that make a very big difference to our crisis?
It's something, in an ideal world, we should have started with that. But I think it's really the right way to go. Also because as societies, we cannot continue with kind of paralyzing the whole of society and the economy. It'll depend also on a few things. The availability of testing. Our track record is not so great, but and ideally for me, testing should be available not just by going online, but also in the pharmacy around the corner, in the community. It should also be available to people who have no symptoms. And also, frankly, without blaming individuals, but this can only work if there's good compliance.
Well, now, I mean, coming on the heels of the Dominic Cummings problem, I mean, that's not the greatest overture to a sense of urging the population to be compliant.
Indeed. I mean, the rules have to be the same for everybody. And if there is a breach of trust, that system, which I think is really the right way to go, test and trace, will collapse and will not work. So let's make sure that from the top to the society as a whole, we all respect these rules.
I was wondering actually what you, as somebody who works as a microbiologist and has worked with many different viruses before, what on earth is it like for you to have had the disease and to have had it as badly as you've had it?
Yeah, after spending, most of my adult life fighting viruses, making their life miserable, a virus finally got me and made my life miserable. My disease, in fact, started about over 2 months ago, and I'm still struggling with the consequences of a chronic lung problem due to a hyperimmune response, not just the virus. It makes a huge difference, whether to be an academic expert or even on the front lines and treating people with Ebola and HIV and so on that I've done, than having had the virus inside. And in my native tongue is Dutch, and we have a term for that, and that says, I'm now an experienced expert. I've gone through it. And that makes me double motivated to fight it, but also realizing that there are chronic conditions. It's not just you have a small flu or something like that, and then, or you die 1%, and that's it, and that's for older people. But it's also about people, and not just about flattening the curve and so on. I think the whole communication around this epidemic has been too much about figures and and concepts, and not about people. This is about people.
I'm just wondering how the international community of microbiologists and virologists and the rest view us.
Yeah, we're viewed as a bit of a confused place, and having acted, quite late. Although I think that it's early days, but this, radical approach of test and trace, and hopefully, I know everything will be put in place to make it a success. I think that will regain our, our reputation, our standing, plus also the scientific work on vaccine development, the clinical trials, and so on. I mean, science and medical research has always been one of our strengths. The test and trace, together with, far stronger involvement at the community level, I think will, for me, make sure that ensure that we will go in a society where the risk of COVID-19 will not disappear. Let's not fool ourselves. Even with a vaccine, it may not disappear, but it will be at levels that we can live with as in general.
Professor Peter Piot, thank you very, very much for talking to us.
Thank you very much, John.